Hi, thank you everybody for joining us today. I'd like to welcome everybody to another edition of E-Cigs DeMISTified. My name is Bob Engel. I'm the Customer Service Manager here at White Cloud. The news we've all been waiting for is here. The FDA's deeming regulations have been released. This was a long time coming, and there is much to discuss, and we will do our best to continue to bring you great speakers as they are available. So we have a lot of viewers in with us today, not surprising since everybody was waiting for this information to come out. And we have built in a good amount of time for questions and answers in this webinar, so please feel free to send us any questions that you do have. You can click the Q&A button down there on the bottom of the screen. We anticipate a lot of questions, so we may not be able to get to all of them. If you ask a question and we cannot get to it to answer it live in the webinar, we will respond to you via email. Also, if you'd like to follow along or ask questions on Twitter, you can use the hashtag DeMISTified. That's DEMISTIFIED. We're going to spell that out for you in the chat box as well. So if you want, you can just copy it from there and paste it into your Twitter. A quick note before we get going, we have spoken with some of our past presenters and are currently working on having more webinars like this in the not too distant future. We do have one webinar confirmed with Joe Barnett, the director of the Vaping Militia, and that's going to be on May 26th. So let's jump right into things. Our speaker today is Dr. Michael Siegel. Dr. Siegel is a professor in the Department of Community Health and Sciences at Boston University School of Public Health. He has been a researcher in the tobacco control area for the past 25 years. Dr. Siegel has published extensively on a wide range of areas in tobacco, including health effects, secondhand smoke, evaluation of tobacco policy, and national strategies to reduce tobacco use. Dr. Siegel has also been writing about the recent FDA deeming regulations on his tobacco analysis blog and wrote an op-ed piece for the Wall Street Journal. Dr. Siegel, thank you for joining us. One moment, Doctor. Dr. Siegel, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
All right. So your initial blog discussed the FDA deeming regulations, referred to them as a disaster for public health. After a few days to digest, has your opinion changed, or has anything changed?
Well, actually, it has changed a little bit in that it's now very clear to me that it's going to be literally impossible for most of the e-cigarette manufacturers, except for maybe a very small number of the largest companies, to put together pre-market applications successfully. The FDA, at the same time that it issued the deeming regulations, also issued a guidance, a draft guidance, which basically explains what they're looking for in these pre-market applications. And after going through that, it's become clear to me that the level of detail and the level of scientific rigor that they're looking for is really way more than any moderate-sized company is going to be able to afford. And I've estimated that the cost, we're looking at more than $1 million easily per application. And so I just don't see how most manufacturers are going to be able to sustain those kind of costs to put these applications together. So if anything, my opinion is even more strongly entrenched that this is just going to be a disaster for public health.
Aside from the cost for the pre-market applications, is there any other burdens associated with the PMTA?
Well, I mean, the scientific burdens are huge. In other words, what you have to show is that the product is going to be beneficial to the public's health. But in doing that, you have to look at not just the users of your product, in other words, smokers who might switch to your product, but you also have to look at the fact that there may be non-smokers, especially youth, who might take up the product. You have to answer the question of whether former smokers might relapse to your product, whether or not former smokers who then relapse will then go back to regular smoking. For youth, you have to not only understand whether they're going to use your product, but what are the chances that they're going to go on to use regular cigarettes after that. So, I mean, these are detailed questions that can only really be answered with epidemiologic studies, observational studies, and clinical trials. And the cost of conducting those studies is, literally in the millions of dollars. So both from an economic perspective and from a scientific perspective, I just don't see how most manufacturers are going to be able to do this.
Oh, I'm sorry about that, Michael. I had my mic was muted there. What are the modified risk claims that they're alluding to in these deeming regulations?
So unfortunately, the FDA did decide to apply the modified risk provisions to vaping products. And so what that means is that the e-cigarette companies will not be able to claim that these products are any safer than smoking. They will not be able to inform consumers that these products contain lower levels of any particular constituents. They will not even be able to say that these are smoke-free. Basically, and I think most problematically, I don't think they'll even be able to say that these are tobacco-free. Basically, you cannot make any comparison between your product and another product saying that your product is safer or contains lower levels of a particular substance. And the only way to be able to make those claims is to submit an application that the FDA would have to approve. The problem is that in order to submit such an application, you have to be able to do studies that are definitive studies showing that your product is safer, which I think, again, is going to be prohibitively expensive. And even if you want to make a reduced exposure claim, which is to just say, hey, this product doesn't have smoke, or this product doesn't have tobacco, or this product has lower levels of whatever component, you actually have to show that consumers will not perceive that that means that it's a safer product. And I believe that's literally impossible because, of course, consumers are going to believe it's safer if it doesn't have tobacco in it or it doesn't have any particular carcinogen in it. And besides, why would you? The whole point of making a modified risk claim is so that people understand that the product is safer. So it makes no sense for the FDA to basically be telling these companies that you cannot tell the truth to your consumers.
Consumers could create, I'm sorry about that, Michael. It seems like limiting what we can say to the consumers could create a market outside of the regulations and normal consumer buying habits. Do you see these regulations creating a potential for a black market?
There's no question about it. I mean, it's already started. I know that many vapors are already starting to stock up on e-liquids, different flavors to make sure that they'll have access to them. Some have started to buy their own nicotine to make sure that they have access to that. So there's no question there's going to be a black market here. And in some ways, I think that undermines the whole point of the regulations, because the point of the regulations is to try to have quality control standards. And if everybody starts buying things on the black market, that negates the whole point of having these uniform standards for all the products. So there's no question there's going to be a black market. And the question really is whether or not the variety of products that are going to be available is enough for most vapors to be able to continue vaping the products that they've become used to.
Well, Dr. Siegel, what are your suggestions for how we can avoid the public health disasters that these regulations could cause?
So I think there's two things that people can do. There are two pieces of legislation that are working their way through Congress. One is called the Cole Amendment, and that is an amendment to the House budget, to the appropriations bill. And the Appropriations Committee has already approved that, and it's now going to the House floor. And what that amendment would do is to change the grandfather date. It would essentially grandfather all existing vaping products as of the time of the regulations, which is basically this August. So any vaping product on the market as of this August would be allowed to stay on the market. It would not have to submit any application for approval to the FDA. So this is a very important amendment that I think it doesn't solve the problem, but at least it would allow the current products on the market to continue to stay on the market. There's also a bill called H.R. 2058, which is another bill being considered by the House of Representatives. And this bill does pretty much the same thing, although this bill is focused just on the grandfather date, changing the grandfather date. So I think that what everyone can do who is concerned about this is to write, call, or email their Congress members, especially in the House of Representatives right now, and let them know that this is going to lead many people back to smoking, and that for the interest of public health, we're asking them to prevent the FDA from taking this action.
If any regulations would you like to see the FDA enact?
Well, I think what the FDA should be doing is to directly set uniform standards for vaping products. I think that this is something that many of the e-liquid, many of the e-cigarette companies have already been talking about. AMSA has already put out standards for e-liquids. I don't think it's that complicated for the FDA to just sit down with vaping companies, e-cigarette manufacturers, e-liquid manufacturers, and just say, look, let's put together a set of standards that everyone should follow, and to simply promulgate those standards, rather than going through this really ridiculous system where companies have to put together these expensive and burdensome requirements just to stay on the market. So that's what I'd like to see them do. Get rid of the new product approval requirement and just promulgate a set of safety standards.
Thank you for that, Dr. Siegel. Will e-cig companies be able to continue selling their products during the PMTA process, or will they be required to pull all products from the shelves pending approval?
So luckily, the FDA will allow products to remain on the market during this process, at least up till 3 years after the regulations go into effect. So the effective date of the regulations will be August 10th, 2016. So manufacturers will have 2 years from that date to submit their pre-market tobacco applications, or PMTAs. Assuming that you submit your application within 2 years, then you can stay on the market for 1 more year while you're waiting to hear back from the FDA. So if you haven't heard back from the FDA for an additional year, you can continue on the market for that year. However, after that 3-year period is up, so 36 months from this August, if you have not heard back from the FDA, you are essentially required to, you are no longer authorized to have your product on the market. So FDA could, if they choose to, enforce the rule and basically force you to take the product off the market. If you hear from FDA earlier, in other words, if they review your application and they decide that that they're not going to accept your application, then you would have to take your product off the market at that time.
Thank you, Dr. Siegel. Sorry about the pause there. Now, with the recent recommendation of the Royal College of Physicians to recommend e-cigarettes for smoking cessation, we see a widening gap in how England and the US view e-cigarettes. What do you attribute to the vastly different views towards e-cigarettes between England's public health and the establishment here in the US?
I think that one difference is that what we have in England that we don't have here is that we have public health groups that are embracing harm reduction. Some of the main groups in the UK, for example, the group that's essentially the equivalent of the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids here, the equivalent of that in the UK actually came out in support of harm reduction using e-cigarettes. So I think that what happened in the UK is that the health groups, if anything, were pushing for more lenient regulations and embraced the idea of harm reduction. Here in the US, every single one of the mainstream anti-smoking and health organizations has come out vigorously against electronic cigarettes and vaping products, and essentially against harm reduction. And so because of that political clout and political pressure, the regulators, I think, in some ways have been kind of forced to take a hard line. So I think largely the main difference has been that in the UK they have health groups that are enlightened and understand the importance of harm reduction, and here in the US we just don't have that.
Great, thank you for that, Dr. Siegel. Now, this next question is still relating to the study that was released by the Royal College. It's kind of a long question, so please bear with me. On page 22 of the document, some confusing language regarding nicotine-free vapor products. The ruling states the alternative warning statement for products that do not contain nicotine, i.e. no nicotine at detectable levels, is revised to read, this product is made from tobacco, but then goes on to say e-liquids that do not contain tobacco or nicotine or are not delivered from tobacco or nicotine do not meet the definition of covered tobacco products as described throughout the final rule, and will not be required to carry an addiction warning or to submit a self-certification. Will you please explain what that means a little bit and how the deeming rule will affect nicotine-free vapor products?
So this is a very complex aspect of the regulation, and it's something that I've had to go over many times to try to understand. But my understanding is basically that if you sell an e-liquid that doesn't contain nicotine, and it's not intended to be used with a nicotine-containing liquid, that you are essentially exempt from the regulations. There is a self-certification process, meaning that you have to certify, you have to submit to FDA a certification stating that your product does not contain nicotine, and you have to demonstrate that it doesn't have nicotine. So presumably that means you would have to submit chemical testing results showing that there's no nicotine in your product. If you do that, then your product is essentially exempt from the regulations. You wouldn't have to put the warning labels on, you wouldn't have to seek pre-market approval. If your liquid is something that's meant to be mixed with other liquids that may have nicotine in them, then you would no longer be exempt from that requirement.
Before we really know exactly what's going to happen. What would be the approximate time products would be going away if producers are not able to comply with the FDA regulations? Are we looking at 1 year? Are we looking at 2 years? How long can we expect?
Well, I don't think anything will really happen before about 3 years, because it's 2 years before the applications have to be submitted. And assuming that companies submit the applications, even if they're not sufficient applications, they'll have another year unless the FDA reviews the application earlier and tells them that it's rejected. But because I expect that these applications are so complicated and that the FDA will literally have their hands tied trying to go through all these applications, I don't think that they're going to get through them before about another year's up. So I think most manufacturers are going to have about 3 years before we really start to see products going off the market. And so I don't think it's desperate. I don't think vapors need to be running out there and stocking up on supplies immediately. We do have some time, and hopefully with either congressional intervention with one of these bills that I talked about, there may be litigation against the FDA. Hopefully there will be something that will overturn the regulations so that this won't come to fruition. But assuming that none of the congressional legislation passes and that there's no litigation that's successful, we're looking at about 3 years before we really start to see the disappearance of some of these products.
Thank you, Dr. Siegel. Yeah, we started getting questions from our customers immediately when these regulations came down. One of the things we've been saying is nothing immediately is going to happen. So it's great to hear you kind of echo that statement as well. Another question I have here, we hear the FDA say over and over, nicotine from tobacco, when they're talking about e-cigs. Are they hinting at the fact that maybe synthetic nicotine or nicotine from another source like eggplant would be cleared for use and avoid these rules?
Actually, that's true. That is the case, because according to the statute, a tobacco product is defined as a product that contains a substance derived from tobacco. So if a company were able to synthesize or obtain synthetic nicotine or obtain nicotine from another source, then it would not be subject to the regulations because it would not be a tobacco product. As long as that company didn't market it as a drug, didn't make therapeutic claims, then essentially they wouldn't face regulation under either of the acts. The problem, though, is that synthetic nicotine is quite expensive, and to synthesize, to produce it in the kinds of quantities that would be required to, basically distribute massive amounts of e-liquids is quite expensive. And other sources of nicotine like potatoes and tomatoes and things like that, again, it's just prohibitively expensive to do that right now. So I'm not sure this is something we're going to see right away. But it is true that at some point, if somebody can develop technology that's able to synthesize nicotine at a cost-effective, in a cost-effective way, that could be a way to skirt around these regulations.
Thank you for that, Dr. Siegel. That's a great explanation of that. We're going to jump into some viewer questions now that we're getting in from the Q&A portion here. The first one I have, I would like to know what DIY regulations would be. Also, where the recording for the webinar will be, we'll answer that one later, but is there any sort of DIY regulations that we could get into?
So there are no regulations on retailers or consumers. So in terms of the DIY, there's no regulations on what you can or cannot do. There's no regulations actually on the retailers. So vape shops, for example, that are selling products, as long as they're not mixing their own juice, they're not subject to the regulations. It's the manufacturers of the products that are subject to the regulations and that must submit these applications. Now, the one exception I should make clear is that the retailers are subject to the sale to minors part of the regulations. So just to make that clear. But in terms of submitting these new products these new product applications to stay on the market, that is the burden that's on the manufacturer of the product. However, if you are a vape shop owner and you're mixing your own juice, you are actually classified as a manufacturer under these regulations. And so you would have to submit an application unless obviously the other choice would be to just not mix your own liquids anymore. So it's the maker of the finished product, the manufacturer of the finished product, that would be responsible for submitting these applications.
Thank you, Dr. Siegel. We have another question here from the viewers. You highlighted the conflict of interest in the recently published tobacco control papers. How do you see the issues of corporate influence in higher education affecting public health?
I think that there's a huge aspect of corporate influence going on here, and I think the biggest part of that is the fact that the FDA is essentially funded by or exists for pharmaceutical companies and has a long relationship with those companies. And the entire way that the FDA thinks about products is in terms of the pharmaceutical model. And essentially what the FDA has done with these regulations is apply the pharmaceutical model to electronic cigarettes. Reading through the draft guidance, this is going to be the absolute safest product ever put on the market. If anybody actually follows these guidelines, they are so strict, and what you have to submit is so incredibly complex that, I mean, this will be the safest product you could ever use, or at least the most documented safety aspects that we've ever had. So they're applying this detailed pharmaceutical model to a product that is really intended as a recreational product. I mean, this is an alternative to smoking. It's not intended to be a drug. I think that the fact that the commissioner of the FDA comes from a pharmaceutical setting, he had actually been a consultant for pharmaceutical companies for many years before he joined the FDA, and the fact that the current FDA commissioner also has a long history of working with and for pharmaceutical companies, I think has had a huge influence. Because they're essentially using that pharmaceutical model to apply to these products. And the end result is it's giving pharmaceutical companies a huge financial advantage, because what otherwise would have been vigorous competition from vaping products for the smoking cessation market is now being essentially reserved just for the big pharma products.
Yeah, it always comes back to the money, doesn't it, Dr. Siegel? The next question we have here, how does the FDA plan on enforcing any of these new regulations? The magnitude of the task that large seems rather impossible.
So I suppose you could say that is one of the good things, is that it is a task that does seem impossible with so many different manufacturers out there. That it is going to be difficult for the FDA to enforce this. I think that the For the most part, my feeling is that, most companies are interested in complying with regulations, and that it'll be relatively self-enforcing. I think that many companies are just going to make a decision as to whether they can or cannot comply with these regulations. And companies that decide that they can't do it or don't want to put the expenditure in, I think are going to, just make a decision to, get 3 years more out of what they can get here, and then, find another business to go into. I don't think that we're going to see a lot of companies that are just trying to hide so that the FDA is, keeping looking around the corner to see if the FDA is coming. But I do think it's a legitimate point in that the FDA resources are being completely diverted to vaping products. And it's insane because it's the cigarettes that are really killing people. And what they're essentially doing is forgetting about cigarettes, and they're putting all their eggs in this one basket. It's an incredible amount of resources and time that are going to go into reviewing these applications and helping companies with the applications and enforcing the e-cigarette rules. Essentially, they have abandoned their mission, which is to regulate tobacco products, and they're turning it into a single-handed, focused crusade on vaping products.
It does seem like we're getting a lot of attention from the FDA right now, and none of that attention is being diverted over to the tobacco industry. We got a lot of questions rolling in here, Dr. Siegel. Bear with me while I'm trying to find the next one we have. Yeah, it just disappeared from my view, so give me 1 second here. Okay. All right. Well, the Cole-Bishop Amendment passed 31-19. Are you encouraged by the passing of this amendment, or more frustrated by the members of Congress that voted against it?
Well, both, but I think that what we need to look for is the positive side of it right now, and understand that it got through the committee, and that's all that matters, despite the vote being close. I think that if there's any silver lining in the cloud of these FDA deeming regulations, it's that they're so bad and so onerous that it makes it very easy for us to argue to Congress that they need to intervene. If the FDA had taken kind of a middle ground approach and put out regulations that were somewhat burdensome but not absolutely ridiculous, it may have been harder to make this argument. But right now, these regulations are so ridiculous, and the extent to which they're asking e-cigarette companies to go just to keep their products on the market, compared to what cigarette companies have to do, which is literally nothing, I think gives us an incredibly strong argument to go to Congress and say, hey, this is ridiculous. This is just completely contrary to the public's health, makes no sense. And so I think we have a legitimate chance. I really do. I think that if anything, I think these regulations make it easier for us to make the case that this is over-regulation at its worst.
It seems like they're coming down on every aspect of the e-cig industry. Now, to go back to the Cole-Bishop Amendment there, in the recent blog post, you mentioned that opponents of the Cole-Bishop Amendment claim that it would hinder the FDA's ability to regulate vapor products. What is the reality of this claim?
I think it's exactly the opposite. I think that if the FDA were freed up from having to create this huge bureaucratic institution that basically does nothing other than help companies putting together these applications and then reviewing the applications and then enforcing the denial or approval of applications, I think if they put their resources instead into just setting standards for these products, that not only would it be better for the public's health, but it would be actually better for the safety of these products, because I think they could directly regulate aspects of the products that are most important for consumer safety, such as battery safety, protecting against overheating of the liquids, quality control standards for the liquid manufacturer. These are things that could be done directly, and I think if the Cole-Bishop Amendment were to pass, it would actually help the FDA. It would force the FDA to focus its time on setting these standards rather than focusing on this bureaucratic nightmare So I see it as exactly the opposite. It doesn't hinder the FDA. It actually forces the FDA to focus on actually regulating product safety.
Thank you for that, Dr. Siegel. Now, to redirect back over to the FDA, in relation to the warning labels that they're proposing, when do retailers have to make sure all products we sell have proper labeling?
So retailers will have 2 years. I'm sorry, 1 year. It's 12 months from the effective date of the regulations to get these warning labels in place, or for the non-nicotine products to submit their self-certifications of the fact that these products don't have nicotine in them.
Thank you for that. Another one here. What exactly is being included in the tobacco accessories under the regs example, batteries, cotton, wire, etc.? So is it looking at all the individual components of an e-cig, or is it looking at the total unit as one package?
So it depends on what you sell. So essentially, any aspect, any component of the product that actually affects the function of the product in terms of the delivery of the aerosol is considered to be a component of the product. Now, if you sell a component of the product that is later manufactured into a finished tobacco product, then you are not considered to be subject to these regulations. It's the ultimate finished product, the manufacturer of the finished product, that is regulated. So, for example, if you are a battery manufacturer and you simply sell your batteries to a company that then incorporates the battery into a system, and the battery manufacturer doesn't have to submit an application, the company that is producing the finished product has to do that. If you are a manufacturer of glass vials that are used to store e-liquids, you do not have to submit a market approval application, but the company that then uses your vials to put the e-liquids in to then sell has to submit an application. And the quality of those vials, because that's part of the product, that's an accessory of the product, that company would have to verify the safety of those vials. That would be part of their pre-market approval. So it's kind of complex, but the ultimate way to think about it is that if you are selling a final product that is going to be purchased, anything that is ready for purchase by the consumer, that is subject to regulation.
You know, it's an interesting point when you're thinking about it as a one unit and the individual pieces that go into those e-cigarettes. Now, going back to the e-liquid, is it the same thing for the e-liquid? Would the flavoring components not have to meet the approval?
So if you are a manufacturer of a flavoring, and the intention is for that flavoring to then be purchased by companies that are making the liquids and to use those flavorings in the liquids, then you as a flavoring manufacturer do not have to submit any application. It would be the e-liquid manufacturer that's using that flavoring that would be subject to the regulation. On the other hand, if you are a flavoring manufacturer who's selling a flavor directly to the consumer with the intention of having that flavor be used in making e-liquids, then you would be subject to the regulations. So it all depends on the intended use of the product, the intended sale, what it's for. And if the intended sale is to the consumer, then you are subject to the requirement. But if the intended sale is to a manufacturer who's going to further process that material, you're off the hook.
Great. Thank you for that, Dr. Siegel. Now, sticking with the flavor components and the e-liquids, specifically regarding those flavors, how much do you think it will cost to get a SKU through the PMTA if we had to go for the approval process?
So let me just give an example of the type of testing that would be required. Because I think by actually understanding exactly what the FDA is recommending, people will understand just why this is so expensive and why it's so ridiculous. So basically, any combination of flavoring and nicotine strength is considered a separate product. So if you sell 10 e-liquids and each of them come in 3 different nicotine strengths, that's 30 different products. And that means that every one of those 30 products needs to be tested separately to figure out what are the components that are present in the e-cigarette aerosol. But it's more complicated than that, because you have to test that e-liquid at all of the different voltages that can be used with that product. So you can't just test your e-liquid in one vaping device. You would have to use a range of devices at a range of different voltage settings or power settings to see what the aerosol constituents are under each of those settings. Not only that, but you're asked to test the constituents at different levels of use, including low, medium, and high use of the product. And you're also asked to test at least 3 different batches of the e-liquid with at least 10 replicates from each batch. So that means for every combination of nicotine and strength and flavoring in your e-liquid, you would have to do 30 separate tests for the e-cigarette aerosol to figure out what is in there, and to document that there's reliability from batch to batch and from sample to sample. But it doesn't end there, because the FDA further asks that you do a test on the stability of the product over time. So you're asked to test the e-liquid at different stages along its shelf life. So if you have a product that you feel has a 1-year shelf life, you will need to actually not just test the product at baseline, but sit it on the shelf for a year and then come back and test it again to see if there's any change in the constituent levels. So you can see how this is playing out. If you make 100 e-liquids coming in different strengths, literally you're going to have thousands of tests that you're going to need to run on the product. These tests, by the way, are expensive. They are the lowest price I could find on any website was about $300 per test. And so if you're talking about 1,000, minimum of 1,000 tests, and that's a conservative estimate, you know, literally we're running into the millions of dollars, and we haven't even gotten past just testing the constituents in the product. We haven't gotten into the safety of the product or the safety of any of these constituents. So you can see how ridiculous this is, and how it's just absurd. The idea that you have to go to this extreme to test and certify your product to stay on the market it's really insane.
It does seem like a daunting task, especially for some of the smaller manufacturers. And speaking of the manufacturers, and tobacco accessories is something you see a lot in this legislation. And then under the regs, examples of tobacco accessories are batteries, cotton, wire, etc. How will the regulations affect a shop that sells DIY supplies, or if they build coils for customers? Would they be considered a manufacturer?
So it depends on what they're doing with the coils. So if they are just getting the coils from a supplier and selling direct to the consumer, and then the consumer is essentially putting together their own product, that would not have to submit an application, because it's the manufacturer of the coil that's being sold that would have to then, in other words, if a manufacturer is selling a coil with the intent that consumers would take that coil and incorporate it into a product, then that manufacturer is the one that's going to need to submit a pre-market application. But if the vape shop owner, for example, is buying the coils and then assembling them into a unit, then that vape shop owner, unfortunately, is going to be the one with the burden of the application. So this is it's an incredibly complex way to think about this, and very difficult and confusing to try to figure out who's responsible for what. But the most important thing to think about is this product being sold for final use by the consumer, or is the retailer doing something with the components to make it into a finished product? And if that's the case, then they are a manufacturer.
And it seems like there's a lot of gray areas here and room for interpretation. One of the other things we hear a lot about is the grandfather date of 2007. Does the 2007 grandfather date seem to only benefit the big tobacco companies?
Well, I mean, clearly this entire regulatory scheme benefits the big tobacco companies because they're the ones who have the money and the scientific expertise and the laboratory facilities to be able to successfully do what's being asked by the FDA. So there's no question that this favors the big tobacco companies. But I want to note, to their credit, the tobacco companies have actually opposed these regulations. They've opposed the grandfather date being pushed back to 2007, and they're actually supporting changing the grandfather date to be the current date of the effective date of the regulations. So, and you may ask, well, why is that? If it's to such great benefit to the tobacco companies to get rid of all the competition, why are they supporting this? And I think that there's two things that are going on. One is I think the companies really want to see a vigorous vaping market. I don't think that they are, obviously they want to have a large market share within that market, but they want to see a vigorous market. And the second thing is that I think the companies understand that if these regulations go through as they are, and there's no change made, that the overall market is going to shrink. And even though the tobacco companies will have a large market share, having a large market share of a small market is probably not as good as having a smaller market share of a huge market. And so I think, I think it's to the tobacco companies' ultimate advantage to see this market thrive. And if it gets to be, as it was predicted, to be a $10 billion industry, and the companies have, 40% of it, that's $400 million, right, or $4 billion right there. And if it's only a $1 billion industry and they have 50%, then that's only $500 million. So I think that they see that these regulations are going to not only contract the market in terms of the market share, but that it's also going to contract the overall vaping market.
Yeah, it seems like we have a lot of changes going on in the landscape of the vaping industry. We have another question here from the audience, and this one, I believe, kind of captures the general feeling of our customer base. Why do we have to prove that it's beneficial to health for e-cigs when the big tobacco companies didn't have to prove tobacco cigarettes were beneficial to health?
Well, that is a beautiful question, and I think that is the exact question that needs to be asked to Congress. If you have one talking point to go to Congress with, it would be exactly that. I mean, I think that's the game-winning strategy to try to get these bills passed. So that is an incredible question, and I think that is exactly the question we need to ask of Congress. Every congressperson, every House member, we have to ask, do you feel that it's appropriate to make the e-cigarette companies go through all these hurdles to prove that they're safe to stay on the market when tobacco cigarettes, which we know kill hundreds of thousands of people a year, don't have to do anything to stay on the market? And it's, that is a travesty to the public's health. That is not protecting the public's health. It's inappropriate. And I think that's the winning strategy to get the House or the Congress to intervene.
Thank you for that, Dr. Siegel. We have another question here about the FDA. Do you think that the FDA's creation of the tobacco master files concept could provide a viable avenue for smaller e-cig manufacturers to register products via the less data-intense substantial equivalent pathways?
I think that the master files are helpful to some extent because it allows a company to essentially use data that another company provided on their products. And so I think that it will help with substantial equivalence applications, because if you have a predicate product and all the information has already been submitted, then it becomes less burdensome for you to show that your product is substantially equivalent to that. But in terms of these new applications, I don't see these master files as being really helpful because nothing has been approved yet. So they're not immediately helpful. I think where they're going to be helpful is 3 years, 4 years down the road. If you have a product and you want to say that it's substantially equivalent, then it's going to be helpful. But by then, the damage will already be done. So I think these master files are a great thing for, at some point down the road, but for the next 3 years, I don't see this as really easing the burden for these new product applications.
Great. Thank you for covering that, Dr. Siegel. Well, we got about 15 minutes left here. I just want to remind the viewers, we have a lot of questions coming in, so please keep sending them in. If we don't get a chance to get to all your questions, we will be responding after the webinar concludes. Now, the next question I have here, to me, it's kind of a funny one. Is payment required at the time of submission for the PMTA, or are we going to be able to pay after the process is complete?
I don't know. That was one despite all the reading, 499 pages, I don't know the answer to that question. So I'm sorry that I can't help with that one.
Oh, no worries. I'm sure that we'll know soon enough once those regulations come down. We have another one here. Since the FDA is an extension of the executive branch, how does the change with the POTUS affect the FDA and their regulations?
I'm sorry, the change in what?
The President of the United States of America.
Oh, okay. All right. All right. Well, I think that if a Democratic candidate were to win the election, I don't think anything is going to change. I doubt that any of those candidates or candidate would really change direction. On the other hand, if the other candidate were to win, I think there could be changes. I think that obviously the FDA is under the executive branch. The president ultimately is the head of the executive branch. And so that is a possibility that a new president could come in and could make some changes. So that's a possibility. Even so, it still is unusual for a president to come in and drastically change the way executive agencies have been operating. Executive agencies tend to have a life of their own that is somewhat independent of the commander-in-chief over time. So it's not immediately clear to me that necessarily that would make a huge difference.
Thank you for clarifying that, Dr. Siegel. What is the likelihood deeming regulations will ultimately be altered by House bills? That is the likelihood that maybe things that don't look so good now could change for the better in the future.
Well, I wish I knew. I don't. It's impossible to predict. At first, when these bills were introduced, I think everyone agreed that it was a real long shot. When the Cole Amendment was first introduced, everyone I talked to from inside the industry, from even from the health groups, everyone saw that as essentially just a long shot. Now that the regulations have been released and they're so terrible and burdensome, I actually think that increases the chances a little bit that we do have a serious chance to get these passed. I think a lot of it depends on the outpouring of protest and opinion from the vaping community. Not only manufacturers, not only retailers, but consumers, vapers. The vapers, I think, have potentially a huge voice, a very powerful voice. And with the kinds of arguments, like I've already heard from the question you asked before from some of your customers, I think that if they can get those messages across to Congress, I think there is a serious chance that we could get congressional intervention here. So let's say that I'm a lot more hopeful today than I was 4 or 5 weeks ago that we can actually make a change here.
Great, thank you for that, Dr. Siegel. We got another question from a viewer here who's wondering if nicotine and e-liquids are going to be allowed to be sent via USPS in 90 days. Is there going to be any restrictions on labeling e-liquids or e-cigarette products in the future?
Well, there are labeling requirements. So with those labeling requirements, which take place within 12 months, those will need to be followed. So selling e-liquids through the mail, you will have to have a label a warning label on that, And that starts at the level of the wholesaler and goes all the way through the whole process. So that's one aspect of the regulation that actually affects all aspects of the chain, from the wholesaler all the way down through the distributor to the retailer to the consumer. Most of the other aspects of the regulation are only affecting the manufacturer. But yes, to sell nicotine or e-liquids through the U.S. mails, you would have to have a warning label on it.
Great. I know a lot of our customers get their products through the mail. We ship a lot of things out of the warehouse here, so they're very concerned about that as well. One more question here, Dr. Siegel. Do we need to ask Congress for separate vapor regulation outside of the deeming regs? If so, what agency should regulate vapor, if not the Center for Tobacco Products?
Well, that's a great point, because even if the Cole Amendment were to pass, or this bill, H.R. 2058, were to pass, those bills will still contain this new product application for new products. So the existing market will be grandfathered in, but any new products on the market will have to go through this extensive application, and it will essentially take away the incentive for any innovation. So the ultimate solution here is to ask Congress not simply to change the grandfather date, but to completely put e-cigarettes under a separate regulatory system that doesn't involve these new product applications, and that an agency would simply set standards for it. Realistically, I don't see another agency being given jurisdiction over the product. I mean, the only one that I can think of would be the Consumer Product Safety Commission, because most consumer products, it's the CPSC that is involved with setting standards and making recalls and things like that. I just don't see that happening. I think at this point, the FDA it's too deeply entrenched in the issue. However, there's no reason why a statute can't simultaneously give the FDA regulatory authority, but at the same time, force the FDA to put e-cigarettes under a separate regulatory framework. And I think that's what really is ultimately needed. The commissioner, or the director of the Center for Tobacco Products, Mitch Zeller, has stated multiple times that he believes in a continuum of risk, and he does believe that products should be regulated based on their risk. Obviously, when you look at the regulations, they do nothing of the sort. In fact, if anything, they do the opposite. I think his argument would be, well, my hands were tied because the statute doesn't allow me to change the grandfather date, and it doesn't allow me, I have to deem these products subject to all of the regulations. I don't agree with that, but if that's his viewpoint, I think that's what we're stuck with. And so I think that if we can get Congress to pass a law that changes the statute and basically says e-cigarettes are to be regulated in a separate framework, they're not to be subject to the same requirements of cigarettes, I think that is the ultimate solution here, and that is what we should be pushing for, as long as it doesn't jeopardize the passage of the Cole Amendment.
And to go back to the Cole-Bishop Amendment, are you optimistic that that amendment's going to pass?
Again, I can't predict it. I don't have magical powers of prediction. All I can say is that it definitely has a chance. 6 months ago, when that bill was first introduced, I would have said that's it's a complete long shot, and the chances of it seeing the light of day are almost nil. And today, I would say it's a chance. There's a chance. I'm not giving up hope on it. But I think the vaping community can have a big impact on it. If the vaping community has loud voice, and congressmen, House members hear from your customers, I do think it could have an impact.
Great. Thank you for that, Dr. Siegel. We have time for just one more question here, so please bear with me while we pull it up. Let me see here. Can you please explain the implications of the verbiage in the final rule, the FDA's intended or reasonably expected, I'm sorry, just disappeared, intended or reasonably expected catch-all?
Yes, it's true. That is a catch-all. I mean, they say that hundreds of times throughout the regulations. And that is a vague term. It's a vague term, and it's subject to interpretation. I think that it's going to be essentially it's a judgment call. It's a judgment call, and it's based on the bulk of the evidence of what a product is intended for. And so if you are if you're producing a e-liquid that is being sold, and the intention of it is that vape shops are using that to mix in with other products, it's going to be hard to argue that that wasn't your intent, or vice versa. If you're selling it to consumers and it's not being changed, it's not being manufactured into a different product, it's going to be hard to make that argument. So I don't know how to answer that question except to say that it's very vague, and that this is also why it's going to be so time and resource intensive for the FDA to enforce, because the rules aren't cut and dry. They're not black and white. And this is going to take a lot of resources and a lot of time for FDA to be looking into every one of these situations and figuring out, how do we define what the intended use was, or the reasonable expectation. I think the only thing I can say is that by adding that clause about reasonable expectation, I think what the FDA is protecting itself against is companies claiming that they have no intention of the product being used for some purpose, but then seeing that consumers are using it for that purpose, and then for those companies to say, oh well, we didn't know that they would do that. So I think the FDA is giving itself an out here, that if consumers are using it for a particular purpose, then you're not going to be able to get out of it by saying, oh well, our intention was not for them to use it in that way. So I think they've covered their butts there by including both of those clauses in there.
Thank you, Dr. Siegel. Well, we're actually out of time for questions now. We've had a lot coming in. I wanted to personally extend a great thank you for spending an hour out of your day, Dr. Siegel, to be with us and explain some of these gray areas for us here as well. So, wow, thank you again, Dr. Siegel, and everyone who attended. There were a lot of questions, and unfortunately, we could not get to all of them. So we will be responding to your questions via email. So make sure you follow Dr. Siegel on Twitter at MBSiegel. And follow his tobacco analysis blog. We'll have some links out after the webinar concludes. And we are also going to be scheduling more of these webinars in the very near future. So follow us on Twitter at WC-Cigs. And thank you everybody again for attending. Dr. Siegel, thank you for spending an hour with us. And we'll be back soon. Have a great day.